What if I told you that the legendary sharpness of Scandinavian blades was born not in the hot furnace of a forge, but in the icy waters of a mountain stream? We are accustomed to admiring the work of the hammer and anvil, forgetting the quiet and monotonous labor that transformed the blank into a deadly weapon. The true power of the sword lay not only in the quality of the steel, but also in the warrior's ability to speak the same language as the stone. It was an art where brute force gave way to incredible patience and knowledge of geology, passed down from father to son.
Angle the chisel lower, son. Feel the grain of the stone.
I feel it.
Good. Now strike.
The Vikings did not buy abrasives in shops. They searched for them under their feet, reading the riverbanks like an open book. Each stone had its own character, its own grain, and its own purpose in the long ritual of sharpening. They understood that an incorrectly selected bar could permanently ruin a blade that cost a fortune. Therefore, the process of finding the perfect whetstone was akin to searching for a precious treasure. This skill was the difference between life and death, because a blunt sword in battle was just a heavy iron stick. Sharpening masters were valued in the army as much as the best Draka helmsmen. Watch the video to the end to learn how the Vikings used ordinary river water and grey slate to create a blade capable of cutting through a hair rope in free fall. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of ancient weaponsmiths, which concerned the choice of tools. The very first and most important step was not sharpening, but finding the right stone on the banks of a turbulent northern river. The Vikings believed that stone had its own soul and will, which needed to be awakened through proper treatment. They looked for smooth, water-worn boulders that stood out from the rest in color and texture. This was not a random choice, but the result of a deep understanding of the properties of natural materials. A warrior could wander knee-deep in icy water for hours, sifting through hundreds of stones in search of the one. He would test the stone with his teeth, check its surface with his fingernail, and even his tongue to determine its porosity. A stone that was too soft wore down quickly and did not provide the necessary sharpness, turning into useless dust. One that was too hard could chip the precious, hardened edge of the sword, irreparably damaging the weapon. The ideal abrasive had to be malleable but durable, like the character of a true northerner. The stone that was found was never used immediately. It required lengthy preparation and grinding. It was split into a convenient shape so that it would fit perfectly in the warrior's broad palm. The surface was smoothed with other, harder rocks to achieve a perfect flatness. Any unevenness or bump on the whetstone could leave a scratch on the mirror-like surface of the blade. It was a job that required no less skill than forging the sword itself. Interestingly, completely different types of stone were required for different stages of sharpening. For rough grinding, coarse-grained sandstone was sought, which removed metal shavings with an aggressive crunch. It determined the geometry of the blade, removing large chips and nicks obtained in previous battles. It was a destructive stone that prepared the ground for more delicate work. Without it, it was impossible to bring damaged weapons back to life. Then medium-grained shale came into play, which could only be found in certain places. These stones no longer gnawed at the metal, but gently smoothed it, removing traces of rough processing. They worked quietly, emitting only a slight hiss when they came into contact with steel. It was at this stage that the cutting edge that would chop through enemy shields was formed. Slate was highly valued, and often became a subject of exchange between clans. The rarest and most valuable was the finishing stone, dense and smooth, resembling a piece of solidified oil. It was used to polish and sharpen the blade to razor sharpness. Such stones were guarded like the apple of one's eye, carried in leather pouches on the belt, and passed down from generation to generation. Losing such a stone was considered a bad omen before a campaign. It was the final touch that turned a piece of iron into a work of art. There was a belief that the stone remembered the hand of its owner and did not obey a stranger. Therefore, each warrior sharpened his own weapon, not trusting anyone else with this intimate process. This created a special spiritual connection between a person and their sword through the stone. There was something meditative about the monotonous movements of the hand, calming the nerves before battle. The warrior put their will to win into every movement. River stones had an advantage over quarry stones, as centuries of water had washed away the weak particles. Only a strong, monolithic skeleton of rock remained, ideal for abrasive processing. Nature itself did the work of selection, discarding everything superfluous and unreliable. The Vikings only had to find these gifts of the river and use them correctly. They lived in harmony with the world around them, using its power. Often, places rich in suitable whetstones were kept secret by specific families or settlements. Knowledge of the geology of their area gave them a strategic advantage over their neighbors. Those who had the best stones had the sharpest swords and axes in the area. It was a kind of technological superiority in that harsh era. Resources determined the outcome of conflicts long before the battle began. We rarely think about how much knowledge and labor went into simply keeping weapons in fighting condition. It was daily, painstaking work that brooked no haste or carelessness. The history of the Vikings was written not only with swords, but also with the stones that sharpened those swords. I would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about such a meticulous approach to choosing a simple stone? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the shape of blades, which contradicts modern films? In movies, we often see swords sharpened to the state of a thin razor, but in reality, such sharpening would be a fatal mistake. The Vikings understood the physics of combat and the properties of their weapons perfectly, so they shaped the cutting edge in a completely different way. They did not strive for maximum thinness, they strove for maximum strength and stability. The secret lay in a lens-shaped sharpening, which today is called convex or appleseed. Instead of flat bevels forming a sharp angle, the blade was smoothly rounded to the very edge. This shape allowed more metal to be retained directly behind the cutting edge. This gave the blade incredible resistance to impact loads when colliding with hard objects. The sword did not get stuck in the wood of the shield and did not chip when striking a helmet. Creating such a geometry on a flat river stone required masterful control of the hands and body. The warrior had to make complex, swaying movements with his wrist with each pass over the stone. The angle of the blade constantly changed, rolling smoothly from the butt to the tip. It was like a dance of the hands, where the slightest mistake could ruin the perfect arc. Years of training were spent developing muscle memory for this movement. The lens-shaped sharpening worked like a wedge, pushing the material apart rather than simply cutting through it. When struck, such a sword inflicted much deeper and more destructive damage. It didn't just cut through the surface, it split the structure of the target due to its geometry. This was critically important in an era when opponents wore thick, quilted armor and chainmail. A thin razor edge would simply get stuck in the fabric or break on the iron rings. Another advantage of this shape was its durability during long campaigns. The lens-shaped edge dulled much more slowly than a straight one and retained its working properties for longer. This meant that warriors had to spend less time sharpening their weapons during campaigns. In conditions of constant danger and lack of time, this was a huge advantage. Reliability was valued above extreme but fragile sharpness. To form the correct lens, stones of varying hardness were used. gradually reducing the pressure. They started with strong pressure to remove excess metal and set the general profile. Gradually, the movements became lighter and lighter, barely touching the surface of the stone. This removed rough scratches and made the surface smooth, ensuring easy gliding. Pressure control was a key skill for the master. Particular attention was paid to the tip of the sword, which was subjected to enormous stress during stabbing blows. Here, the sharpening angle was made slightly blunter, strengthening the tip for piercing hard obstacles. This allowed the sword to pierce chain mail and find vulnerable spots in the enemy's defense. The sword was a complex tool with variable geometry along the entire length of the blade. Closer to the hilt, the blade could be thicker to parry blows. The Vikings did not use protractors or templates. They relied solely on their eyesight and tactile sensations. The geometry was checked with the pad of the thumb, which could feel the slightest deviations. An experienced warrior could determine the correctness of the sharpening in complete darkness simply by running his finger along the blade. It was a fusion of man and tool on an intuitive level. The feel of metal was in their blood. Polishing the lens-shaped bevel also played a practical role, reducing friction on impact. A smooth surface entered the target more easily and exited it more easily, which was important for the speed of combat. The mirror-like shine was not just decoration, but a functional necessity. Every glint on the sword testified to its deadly effectiveness. Beauty and functionality went hand in hand. Thus, the shape of the blade was the result of harsh natural selection on the battlefield. Those whose swords did not break or dull after the first blow survived. This geometry, born of practice, is still considered one of the most perfect for cutting weapons. The Vikings knew a thing or two about reliability. How long do you think such work took? What they found in the old archives completely changes our understanding of the blade sharpening process. Previously, it was believed that water was only needed to cool the metal or reduce friction, but ancient craftsmen invested much more in this process. For the Vikings, water was a key element in a complex chemical reaction that allowed them to achieve perfect sharpness. They knew that if the surface of the stone was properly prepared, water would turn into a living substance capable of changing the nature of abrasion. This was not ordinary wetting, but a conscious part of the technology. The craftsmen created a special stone-water mixture, which modern gunsmiths call a suspension. It was created from a combination of water, tiny particles of stone, and metal dust worn off the blade. These elements were mixed together during the work, forming a thick, almost creamy mass. This mixture worked more finely than the whetstone itself, creating a unique effect similar to the work of thousands of microscopic cutters. It was this mixture that allowed the blade to be sharpened to such a degree that it could split a hair in the air. The warrior began the process by thoroughly wetting the whetstone with water taken directly from a river or rain puddle. Then he took another stone, small and smooth, which was used to activate the surface of the whetstone. In different traditions, such stones were called by different names, but the principle was the same. The warrior vigorously rubbed the main stone with the small stone until a thick, cloudy paste appeared on the surface. This was a sign that a usable suspension had begun to form. When the mixture became sufficiently saturated, the warrior watched as it slowly dripped off the stone, leaving a thick grey layer. It was this paste that was the main secret of the exceptional sharpness of northern blades. It created a smooth, controlled glide and allowed the metal to be ground with minimal loss. Warriors knew that it was the quality of the suspension that determined the success of the work, and paid much more attention to it than to the blade itself in the early stages of sharpening. The suspension acted as a shock absorber between the metal and the hard stone. It prevented the blade from rubbing roughly against the abrasive, making the work more stable and accurate. The grain in the mixture was constantly crushed during movement, turning into a soft, almost silky powder. This provided a smooth transition from rough metal removal to fine polishing without the need to change stones. The craftsman could change the nature of the work right in the process. The warrior adjusted the intensity of the abrasion by simply changing the density of the mixture. Adding water made the suspension softer, allowing for a fine finish. If he wanted to remove more metal, he reduced the amount of water and made the paste denser. This turned sharpening into a flexible process controlled by the craftsman's hand. The same stone could perform several functions, which was extremely valuable in camping conditions. Water itself also played an important role. Ancient craftsmen noticed that water from different sources behaved differently. Rainwater was considered the softest, river water was considered universal, and spring water was avoided because of its hardness. Water could change the structure of the suspension, helping the stone to reveal its abrasive properties. Sometimes craftsmen added a little sour wine or vinegar to the water to dissolve dark deposits on the blade. This improved the adhesion of the mixture and sped up the work. Warriors understood that the chemical composition of water affected the result, even if they did not know the scientific explanations. They observed how soft water made sharpening smooth, and hard water made it rough and uneven. Therefore, an experienced warrior always chose the source of liquid as carefully as the stone itself. For him, water was not just a liquid, but a tool. One of the key indicators was the sound the blade made when moving through the suspension. Warriors spent many years learning to distinguish the nuances of this sound. A dull, even rustle meant that the suspension was working correctly and the metal was being removed evenly along the entire length of the blade. This was the ideal sound. If a sharp grinding sound was heard, it meant that the mixture had become too liquid or that grains of sand had fallen onto the surface. In this case, work was stopped immediately. An experienced craftsman could determine the degree of pressure and the distribution of pressure on the blade by the sound. It was the true language of metal and stone, known only to those who sharpened weapons every day. Thus, sharpening was transformed from a mechanical operation into a musical improvisation, where every movement was significant. This made the process almost meditative and required complete concentration. The color of the suspension also played a huge role in the master's work. As the sharpening progressed, the mixture darkened, becoming a rich black from the steel particles. This color was not just a result of friction. It served as an indicator of how tightly the blade fit against the stone. The master could see which areas of the blade were in contact with the surface and which required additional work. It was a natural marking created by the process itself. The shades of the suspension helped to identify the slightest irregularities and correct the geometry of the blade. Instead of paints, charcoal, or chalk lines, warriors used what the metal itself produced. This allowed them to perfectly align the cutting edge even in the field. This made the sharpening process completely self-sufficient and did not require any additional tools. A very important part of the work was to prevent the suspension from drying out. The drying mixture turned into a coarse abrasive capable of damaging the surface that had been worked on for hours. Therefore, the master added water in small portions, maintaining the desired consistency. He made sure that the mixture remained alive and mobile, otherwise all the work could be in vain. This control required constant attention. The master could not be distracted because even a short pause could lead to drying out. Sharpening became an exercise in patience and discipline. It was such a delicate process that the experience was passed on only from mentor to apprentice through long years of practice. The use of a suspension allowed the famous matte finish to be achieved on the blade's bevels. It was not the mirror-like shine that modern craftsmen often strive for. Instead, it produced a soft, satin glow, reminiscent of the calm surface of the sea. This texture was considered ideal for a combat blade. It produced less glare and did not reveal the warrior's position in sunny weather. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was born from experience, observation, and daily practice. The Vikings did not simply sharpen their weapons. They studied the metal, listened to it, and learned its character. That is why their blades, found 1,000 years later, still amaze us with their quality. Like this post if you learn something new about ancient technologies.
Look at that knotwork. It's magnificent.
Definitely high status. Get the photogrammetry rig set up.
Already on it.
Guess what happened next when archaeologists began to find strange stones in warriors' graves? In almost every burial of a noble Viking or a simple warrior, small bars with a hole were found.
What do you make of these bars?
I'm not sure. I've never seen anything like them in a Viking context before.
Be careful with that bar.
The precision of these holes, it's extraordinary for this period.
These were not just tools, but personal amulets that accompanied the warrior in life and death. A pocket sharpener was as essential a piece of equipment as the sword itself. These bars were made from the highest quality slate or quartzite. They were carefully shaped, thoroughly polished, and drilled with a hole for a leather cord. Warriors wore them on their belts or around their necks so that the tool was always at hand. At any moment, during a rest or before a battle, they could quickly sharpen a dull blade. The availability of the tool was a guarantee of survival. The size of such a sharpener usually did not exceed the length of a palm, which made it ideal for field conditions. It could not be used to resharpen a sword, but it could maintain its working sharpness for months. The technique for working with such a stone differed from stationary sharpening. Here, the blade was not moved across the stone, but the stone was moved across the stationary blade. This required different motor skills and techniques. Such sharpeners were often decorated with carvings or silver inlays, turning them into works of jewelry art. This spoke of the high status of the owner and his respect for his weapon. A richly decorated sharpener could be a valuable gift from a jarl to a loyal comrade in arms. It symbolized readiness for battle and professionalism. A utilitarian object became a status symbol. Some of the bars found show deep signs of wear, indicating that they served their owners for decades. These grooves and indentations are silent witnesses to hundreds of preparations for battle. The stone wore away, giving its essence to the metal, sacrificing itself for the warrior's victory. This was the philosophy of an instrument serving its master. Objects had their own biographies. Interestingly, the shape and material of such pendants could indicate the warrior's origin. Analysis of the rocks shows that the Vikings carried their favorite stones thousands of kilometers from home. A stone from their native Norway could be found in a burial site in England or Russia. It was a piece of their native land that gave them strength in a foreign land. A connection to home through stone. Sharpening a sword in the field was an important ritual that calmed the nerves between battles. The monotonous movement of the stone across the steel helped to focus and put thoughts in order. It was a kind of meditation available to the harsh northern warriors. Psychological relief through manual labor. Sagas often mention moments when heroes sharpen their weapons before a decisive battle. This is a literary device that emphasizes the inevitability of fate and the readiness to meet it with weapons in hand. The sound of a whetstone against steel was a harbinger of imminent battle, a symbol of the inevitability of fate. A pocket sharpener was a sign of a professional who always kept his tools in order. A sloppy attitude towards weapons was considered a disgrace and a sign of unreliability. A sharp sword and a well-maintained sharpener were the hallmarks of a true Viking. Discipline began with the little things. Thus, a small piece of stone on the belt was no less important than a large shield on the back. It ensured constant combat readiness and was a warrior's faithful companion on all paths. Do you know where the best stones for all of Europe were brought from? The Norwegian settlement of Eidsborg was not a capital or a major port, but it was known to blacksmiths throughout Europe. It was here that the legendary Eidsborg slate was mined, a stone that was considered the standard for sharpening weapons. Geological luck gave this place deposits of a unique rock. It was a hard, fine-grained quartz mica slate, ideal for working with metal. Stone quarrying in Eidsborg began in the Viking Age and developed into a real industry. Local residents cut huge blocks of rock, which were then split into thousands of pieces. The entire region lived off this trade, supplying half of the known world with sharpeners. This was an example of early industrial specialization across an entire region, an economy built on stone. Archaeologists find Eidsborg bars in Denmark, Sweden, Germany, England, and even Poland. This indicates the existence of well-established trade routes along which heavy loads of stones were distributed across the continent. The Vikings used their ships not only for raids, but also for large-scale logistics. Stone was a heavy but extremely profitable commodity.
This one clearly hasn't been used yet. See the edge.
So this confirms it was cargo, not just personal gear.
The trade in whetstones brought huge profits, comparable to the trade in furs or iron. A high-quality bar was expensive because the quality of weapons and tools depended on it. Merchants eagerly took this commodity, knowing that there would always be demand for it everywhere. It was the hard currency of the Middle Ages, a reliable investment.
This stone has the grit I seek. We have a trade.
May it serve you well, merchant.
For transportation, the stones were often only roughly processed, leaving the final finishing to the buyer. This protected the goods from damage during transport and reduced their cost. The blanks were tied into bundles or placed in barrels, separated by straw. Logistics required careful handling, even for stone. Every batch was counted.
Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All accounted for.
Count them again.
We must have the full 100 by tidefall.
Aye, master. Look at the quality. As profitable as iron or good furs in trade. This will keep your blades sharp across Europe.
Slate from Eidsborg was distinguished by its unique light color and characteristic structure. An experienced blacksmith could tell a fake from a real Norwegian stone at first glance. The Eidsborg brand was a guarantee of quality long before the concept of a trademark appeared. Its reputation was built on centuries of impeccable service. Control over the quarries and stone transport routes was an important political factor. Local chiefs grew rich on duties and trade, strengthening their power. Stone became the basis of the power of entire clans. Geology dictated politics. Interestingly, even after the decline of the Viking era, trade in these stones did not cease. The Eidsborg quarries operated throughout the Middle Ages and even into modern times. The legacy of the ancient craftsmen outlived them by many centuries. The stability of the tradition is striking. This proves that the Vikings were not only destroyers, but also creators of a complex economic system. They connected northern Europe with a network of trade routes along which technology and resources moved. The whetstone was one of the threads that held this world together. Globalization began earlier than we think.
Feel the edge it keeps. No finer grit in all the Baltic.
Your price is high, Norseman, but the quality speaks truth. We have a deal.
Without Eidsborg slate, many famous swords would have remained blunt pieces of iron. The history of wars and crafts is inextricably linked to the history of geology and trade. Stone was the foundation of civilization. What if everything you were taught is outdated, and the shine of a sword was not just for beauty? In Viking culture, the appearance of weapons had enormous social significance. A sword was the most expensive item a man owned, worth as much as several farms. Therefore, polishing the blade was a way of demonstrating the owner's wealth and success. A dull, poorly crafted sword was a disgrace to a chieftain.
The blade was forged in the northern fires, sharp enough to cut through chainmail. Feel the weight.
Impressive craftsmanship. What is your price?
The finishing polishing process took weeks of painstaking work. The finest stones, powdered crushed coal, ash, and even leather were used. The craftsman achieved such a clean surface that you could see your reflection in the blade. This was called water shine and was considered the height of chic, mirror of death. Polishing revealed the complex structure of the metal, especially on the famous Damascus steel swords, or those with a welded pattern. Layers of dissimilar steel formed bizarre patterns on the surface, snakes, waves, or stars. These patterns were the sword's passport, confirming its quality and complexity of manufacture. Without careful polishing, this beauty would have remained hidden under a layer of scale. The Vikings gave their swords names, endowing them with personality. Leg-biter, battle-flame, golden hilt. These names often reflected the external qualities of the blade. The shining sword was the hero of skaldic songs and legends. It lived its own life in the epic of the people. The shine of the sword also had a practical psychological effect on the enemy. A platoon of warriors, bearing their blades glistening in the sun, was a terrifying sight. The blinding glare hurt the enemy's eyes, and the shine of the metal spoke of the high quality of the weaponry. It was part of a psychological attack before the clash, fear of wealth and power. A polished surface was more resistant to corrosion. Moisture and dirt had nowhere to cling to on a perfect mirror. Rust, the main enemy of iron, appeared much more slowly on a polished blade. Thus, beauty directly prolonged the life of the weapon. Practical luxury. Not only stones were used for polishing, but also organic materials. Polishing pastes were made from fat and the finest dust of precious stones, such as garnet. These were the secret recipes of the masters, which were not disclosed to outsiders. The chemistry of shine was secret knowledge. Caring for such a sword required constant attention from its owner. After each touch of the blade, it had to be wiped with an oiled cloth to remove fingerprints. Hand sweat was an aggressive environment for carbon steel. Owning a sword was a responsibility, not just a privilege. Discipline in care. Status swords with rich polishing and finishing were often not used in ordinary skirmishes. They were saved for decisive battles or judicial duels. For everyday work, a warrior might have a simpler sword, a working tool of war. The division between ceremonial and combat swords already existed. The splendor of the ancient sword is a message to us across the centuries that beauty and death always went hand in hand in Viking culture. They knew how to see beauty even in instruments of murder, turning war into art. Why do you think wool was used to protect such beauty? A sword sheath was not just a carrying case, but a complex system for preserving weapons. The internal structure of Viking sheaths concealed an ingenious secret that ensured the preservation of precious blades. The wooden slats of the base were always lined with sheepskin or woolen fabric on the inside. The wool was glued with the pile facing inward toward the metal. The main secret here was lanolin, a natural animal wax found in sheep's wool. This substance is an excellent preservative, protecting metal from moisture and oxidation. Every time a warrior put his sword in its sheath, the blade was automatically lubricated with a thin layer of fat. It was a built-in self-lubrication system. The dense pile tightly wrapped around the blade, holding it inside the scabbard. The sword did not rattle when walking, and could not accidentally fall out even when running or riding a horse. At the same time, the soft wool did not scratch the mirror polish. Unlike wood or leather, it was the perfect damper. The wool lining also served as a thermal insulator. It smoothed out sharp temperature changes, preventing condensation from forming on the metal surface. Condensation was a hidden killer of blades, causing rust from the inside. The wool absorbed excess moisture, working like modern silica gel. The scabbard had a multi-layered construction. On top of the wool was wood, usually thin strips of linden or willow, light and durable. The outside was covered with expensive leather, often decorated with embossing. A metal tip protected the bottom of the scabbard from abrasion against stones. The mouth of the scabbard was often reinforced with a special leather or metal roller. This allowed the blade to be guided when inserted, so that the sharp edge would not cut through the scabbard material. Everything was thought out to the smallest detail for convenience and safety. Accessory engineering. For additional protection, a little oil was sometimes poured into the scabbard. The wool absorbed it, becoming a permanent reservoir of lubricant. A sword stored in such conditions could lie for years and look like new when removed. Preservation technology for centuries. Making the right scabbard was expensive, sometimes costing up to a third of the price of the sword itself. But it was foolish to skimp on this, as a poor quality scabbard could ruin a magnificent blade in a single winter. The Vikings understood that the miser pays twice. This protection system was so effective that it was used in Europe for many centuries after the Vikings. Nature provided humans with all the necessary materials. They just had to figure out how to combine them. A brilliantly simple solution. Wool and steel, soft and hard, worked together to preserve the deadly power of the weapon. This is an example of the perfect symbiosis of natural materials in ancient technologies. Battle is chaos, dirt, and blows against hard objects. Even the highest quality blade, created by a master and sharpened to razor sharpness, lost its edge after a few powerful blows. When metal collided with metal, small cracks, nicks, and chips appeared on the cutting edge. This was an inevitable consequence of direct contact with shields, helmets, and iron-clad opponents. The sword gradually lost the fine line that made it a deadly weapon. Therefore, a warrior had to be able to restore the blade to its combat form right at the halt. The conditions of the campaign did not allow waiting to meet a blacksmith, and every loss of sharpness could cost a life. The Vikings knew that weapons required care, just as the body required food. And the more skilled a warrior was at quickly restoring the edge, the higher his chances of coming out of the next battle alive. It was a skill that was considered as important as sword fighting in battle. This is where the simplest pocket sharpener, carried by almost all experienced warriors, came into play. It was a small but invaluable tool that hung around the neck or on the belt. In the field, there was no time to create a complex suspension. There were no conditions for long, calm sharpening, which could take an hour. Sharpening became a quick, rough, and extremely practical operation. There was only one goal: to restore the blade's ability to cut confidently. Speed was valued on campaigns. The enemy could attack suddenly, and one could not afford the luxury of sitting by the water in thought. Therefore, warriors did what was necessary here and now. They removed burrs, straightened bent edges, and repaired the most severe damage. This was not a process of improving the blade, but a process of preventing its rapid destruction. This approach was entirely dictated by the harsh logic of survival. The warrior would sit down by the fire, rest the hilt of his sword on the ground or his knee, and make short, powerful movements along the damaged areas. He knew that in battle, the sword was used along its entire length, which meant that every part of the edge had to be able to withstand another blow. If the dent was too severe, the metal could bend inward and needed to be straightened. In this case, the heel of a knife or another smooth steel object was used to restore the blade's shape. This movement resembled straightening bent wire, only it was performed much more carefully. This straightening was called smoothing. It did not make the sword perfect, but it restored its functionality. The warrior repeated the movement until the sound and feel of the edge sliding became smooth. Sometimes it took longer than desired, but it was better than going into battle with a damaged weapon. This stage was the basis of quick field repair. Field conditions often forced the Vikings to use whatever materials were at hand to care for their weapons. If the whetstone was lost or broken, it was replaced by a smooth river boulder. Stones found on riverbanks made good abrasives. Sometimes it was enough to sharpen the edge a little on a natural stone to restore its sharpness. Even snow or wet sand were sometimes used for rough processing, if there were no other options. A piece of leather on a belt was used for the final touch-up. It helped to remove small burrs that appeared after rough work with a stone. The belt, slightly stretched between the hands, became an excellent tool for finishing. Such resourcefulness replaced a whole set of tools in conditions where a warrior had only what he carried with him. The ability to adapt was an important part of the craft of war. On campaigns, warriors often helped each other repair equipment and weapons. In the evening, when the detachment stopped for the night, the air was filled with a characteristic sound, the grinding of stone against metal. It was the sound of a lively camp, where everyone was busy with their own business. Some repaired clothes, others repaired belts, and still others sharpened swords. It was part of the routine preparation for the next day. Such collective work strengthened the spirit of unity. The warriors shared their experience and advised each other on how best to repair a particular chip. Sometimes the more experienced fighters took the swords of the young warriors themselves to show them the correct movements. These evenings by the campfire became a real school of craftsmanship, passing on knowledge without words and without formal lessons. Special attention was paid to removing rust. The northern climate was humid, and damp metal began to develop a reddish coating in just an hour. The Vikings considered rust to be a disease of metal that needed to be treated immediately. Swords were cleaned with sand, ash, or even soil if nothing else was available. After cleaning, the blade was rubbed with lard, which created a protective layer. This was an important part of maintenance, allowing the blade to be preserved for many years. Warriors knew that rust not only spoiled the appearance but also weakened the metal. If left to develop, the edge could begin to crumble or crack. Therefore, fighting corrosion was as important as fighting enemies. A clean and lubricated blade was considered a sign of discipline, respect for weapons, and self-respect. If a sword suffered serious damage, such as deep nicks or a crack, the warrior understood that it was impossible to repair it on his own. He tried not to use the blade to its full potential until he could see a blacksmith. Attempting to resharpen a severely damaged area on his own could completely ruin the geometry of the blade. In this case, the sword would become weaker and less reliable. Therefore, the ability to correctly determine the limits of possible repair was considered an important quality of an experienced fighter. The danger was that the crack could spread at the most inopportune moment. If the blade broke in battle, it almost always meant death. A Viking had to know exactly how to assess the condition of his sword and make a decision, to continue using it or to temporarily put it away and take another weapon. This wisdom came only with experience.
A warrior's wisdom is knowing when a blade cannot be trusted. To risk it in battle is to risk everything.
The quality of the sharpening had to be tested somehow, and the Vikings had their own standards and tests. Legends tell of swords that could cut through a bundle of wool floating down a river. Of course, this is poetic exaggeration, but the real tests were no less impressive and severe. One common method was the nail test. A sharp blade should catch on the surface of the nail when lightly touched, rather than sliding across it. If the sword slid, it was blunt. This simple test is still available to everyone today. A more serious test was cutting freely hanging objects. This could be a rope, a piece of cloth, or a vine. The sword had to cut through the target cleanly, without a swing, only by speed and sharpness. If the object flew away instead of being cut, the sharpening was poor. There was a test for cutting an animal carcass, which showed the penetrating ability of the blade. The warrior had to cut a pig or sheep carcass with one blow. This simulated hitting an enemy's body and gave an understanding of real combat effectiveness, a cruel but necessary practice. The strength of the edge was also tested by striking a horn or bones with the sword. The blade should not chip or bend significantly. This balance between hardness and toughness was the main indicator of the quality of heat treatment and sharpening, an exam for blacksmiths and sharpeners. Warriors often competed in the sharpness of their swords, turning the tests into entertainment. Who could cut a stick cleaner? Whose sword would penetrate a wooden pole deeper? This maintained a spirit of rivalry and encouraged the maintenance of weapons. Poor sharpening could be a cause for ridicule. A warrior with a dull sword was considered lazy or unskilled. Social pressure forced them to maintain high standards. Reputation was more valuable than gold. We have come a long way from searching for stones in a cold river to a gleaming blade in a warrior's hand. Viking technology, based on empirical experience and observation of nature, is astonishing in its effectiveness. They did not know chemistry or physics, but they intuitively understood the processes occurring between steel and stone. Today we use synthetic abrasives, diamond pastes, and electric machines. We can sharpen a knife faster and sharper than any Viking. But there is a magic in hand sharpening on natural stones that no machine can replace. It is a dialogue with the material, cultivating patience and respect for work. Many modern knife makers are returning to the old methods. Japanese waterstones, Arkansas novaculite, Belgian slate, all are direct descendants of those very river stones. The principles of suspension and grain selection have remained unchanged for 1,000 years. Physics does not change. The lens-shaped sharpening that was so valued by the Vikings is back in fashion. It has proven its superiority for heavy work and survival. Bushcrafters and tourists choose the lens for its reliability, repeating the choice of ancient warriors. History has come full circle and returned to its origins. Pocket sharpeners have not disappeared either, only the materials have changed. Every hunter or soldier knows how important it is to be able to sharpen a knife in the field. The principle of autonomy and readiness remains relevant in any era. We can learn from the Vikings not only techniques, but also attitudes towards things. For them, a sword was not a consumable, but a companion and partner. Caring for a tool was part of a culture that shaped a man's character. This is something we often lack in our consumer society. Natural stone teaches us to slow down. In a world of instant results, sharpening requires time and peace. It is a meditation that connects us to generations of ancestors who made the same movements thousands of years ago. A connection between times through tactile sensation. We have seen that behind the image of a fierce barbarian lay a skilled craftsman with a keen sense of the nature of materials. The Vikings created a culture of weaponry where stone, water, and steel were woven into a single whole. Their methods may seem archaic, but their effectiveness has been proven by centuries of real-world use. The history of sharpening is the history of human civilization. the history of our attempt to make the world sharper and more obedient to our will. And the Vikings wrote one of the most vivid chapters in this history. Do you think you could find the patience to spend hours polishing a blade with a river stone? Or would you prefer modern methods? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new dives into the history of ancient technologies.